So today we're going to talk about composition. So namely, how to get better compositions in our images, right? So it brings in that wow factor. So we're going to discuss guidelines and techniques that will help improve your shots. So we'll talk about the rule of thirds. We need to clearly define your subject. We're going to talk about framing your elements within that composition. We need to watch the edges of the frames. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about a few bonus tips and techniques that will help you draw more attention to your subject and also add depth to your images. Let's get started. Okay, so let's talk about the rule of thirds. So I'm going to use the images that I posted up on my thumbnails for the Camera Doesn't Matter video. I think these are going to be two good examples of some bonus tips that I'm going to be talking about later on in the video. So we'll talk about, so the rule of thirds, we're going to use we'll use the beach one. So with that, the rule of thirds, so in your frame, if you look at it, you're going to have 4 lines, 2 vertical, 2 horizontal, and what it does is it breaks up your image or your view in the viewfinder or your LCD, depending on whether you have a DSLR or mirrorless. It breaks it up into thirds. From top to bottom, left to right, you have 3 sections. And then within those 4 lines, you have 4 little points. Those are called points of interest. Anything that you want to draw attention to, it'll be stronger if you put it in those points of interest. Now, there are always exceptions, and as I said before, the rule of thirds is not truly a rule, but more of a guideline. If it makes sense to break these rules, then by all means do it if it's going to make your image stronger. Okay, so but generally your points of interest are in those 4 areas, and that's where you want to put your subject. So if you're doing wildlife, portraits, cityscapes, if you're taking buildings, images of buildings or vehicles or whatever the case may be, you put your subject in one of those 4 points, depending on how you want to frame your subject and the image. One consideration when you put your subject in one of those 4 points, or in, depending on what third you put your subject, say you have a person, you're taking a portrait and they are looking off to their left, right? If they're looking to the left, you want to put them on that right third so it gives them room to look into the frame. If you do the opposite, what that does is creates tension. So if that's what you're going for in the mood of the photograph, then that's the perfect way to do it. Otherwise, it just doesn't look natural. Wildlife, same thing. If they're moving left to right, then put your animal on that left third, and then have that room in the right third so they're moving into the frame. Another thing with the rule of thirds is horizon lines. Now, that line will help you make sure that your horizons are straight. That's one. Secondly, unless you're purposefully doing like a symmetrical framing, you really don't want to have your horizon line directly in the middle. One, if you have a person in the image along with some kind of horizon line, typically it's going to be cutting them off somewhere weird. So you don't want to do that. Secondly, having the horizon just there in the middle of the frame really creates a static or boring image. So for instance, in the beach scene, I purposefully put the horizon in the middle because I had a lot of foreground interest that led into my main subject, which was the sky. And here in a little bit, I'll talk to you about the tips and techniques to show you why your eyes are more drawn to the sky, even though there's a lot of foreground. The foreground will help the sky. So for that reason, I put the horizon in the middle. All right, so now we know why the rule of thirds exists, or the guidelines basically, to help strengthen your photograph. So with that, let's set up our camera so you can actually see those grid lines on your display. Now, a caveat is if you are on a DSLR camera, you can only see these guidelines if you're on live view on the LCD. If you're on a mirrorless, you can see it in the viewfinder as well as on the LCD. So let's set that up. All right, here we are. Let's turn on our rule of thirds guides on our cameras. So if you're on a Sony a7R III, you can follow along. I don't know if the other Sony cameras have the same menu, but what you want to do is go into your menu, tab 2, page 6 for those of you that have an a7R III. If not, try to look for in your menu where it says display, and then that's the same with any other camera manufacturer. Just look for your display options, and then it'll say grid lines, guidelines, markers, something to that effect. So we go on there, go to the rule of thirds, click on that, and now you can see that we have our rule of third grid lines on there, and that will help us with setting up our framing for our composition. So I hope this helps, and let's get back into the video. All right, now that we have set up our camera so we can actually see the grid lines on our displays, let's talk about subject matter. It is really important to know what your subject is. What is it that you want your viewer to be focused on? Because without this, we have a lot of chaos in the frame, and we don't want your viewer to be just aimlessly looking around at your image, okay? So let's showcase our subject, and let's not let the viewer get confused in the chaos of an image if you don't have that subject showcased, okay? In the techniques and tips that I'm going to talk about, the bonus ones here in a little bit, I will help you with getting a focal point onto your subject. Okay, so we don't want the viewer's eyes to be wandering aimlessly. We want the viewer's eyes to start in a location and then wander into the image right to the focal point, which is your subject. Okay, so make sure your subject is showcased. Make sure your subject is the focus or the focal point of your image. Okay, so framing. Framing and composition are sometimes used interchangeably. In some ways they are, in some ways they're not, because a composition is basically everything inside the image, where framing is how you put the subject and the elements inside of that composition, inside that frame that makes the composition, right? So when we're framing, we want to look at our subject. Well, for instance, what I do when I get to a location, I grab my camera and I look through the viewfinder. I have the camera up to my eye and I'm looking. I am standing up, lowering down. If sometimes I have a ladder, or I might climb onto the hood of my car and check the different heights. I'll go left, I'll go right, maybe I'll walk around if that's possible. Looking at different angles and perspectives that will best suit or make the image better. So that's the first thing in framing your subject. Secondly, using the rule of thirds or the guide of the thirds, frame your subject depending on how you envision or how you want the end product to be, right? So whether it's if you want to center it like I did with the beach photo, or if you want to offset on the thirds like I did with the Crystal Palace photo. Okay. Uh, so use the thirds, use the interest points. So if need be, whether maybe you're doing an environmental portrait, make sure the subject, your person, is in one of those strong points, and then show the background to enhance or to help your subject. Okay. Watch out for the horizon lines. Make sure that your horizon lines are straight, right? If you don't need it, do not put your horizon in the middle of the frame. Either go up or go down, depending on what you need. Here's what I find a lot of times with newer photographers. When they are taking an image, they're not watching the edges of the frame. So what happens is you have something that's creeping into the frame that we don't want. So maybe a tree limb, a car, a person starts to walk into your frame, an animal, whatever the case may be. So when we're set up, make sure before you snap that picture, before you press that shutter button, look at the edges of the frame to make sure nothing is creeping in that we don't want. Okay. Unfortunately, sometimes we can't help it because of situation, whether we can't move in one direction or another. Maybe we're zoomed out all the way or we're zoomed in all the way, and you still have something that's creeping into your frame. If that's the case, having the shot is better than not. And then you can go into your post-processing program, whether it's Photoshop or something else. Hey everyone, future me here. Unfortunately, yesterday when I was showing you the examples for the bonus tips and techniques, there was no audio being captured on my screen recording on my iPad, so I was not able to synchronize the footage yesterday. So we're going to try this again. On our bonus tips and techniques, first thing we want to talk about is drawing more attention to your subject, right? We're going to take the beach scene here. The first of many is leading lines. Leading lines is nothing more than how you frame your shot, where there are going to be lines in your image that kind of draw you into your subject. Let's take the beach scene here. And as you can see, the sky was my main subject. That's what I want everybody to draw attention to. Now, the way I set up this frame, if you look at here, we have this area here that forms a leading line into the sky, as well as the edge of the water and the sand here leading up into the sky. Now, we could argue that the sand, this path here, itself is a leading line up into the sky. This will help draw the viewer's eye from the front of the image to the back of the image, or from the front of the image to your subject. So that is one way to help draw attention to your subject. A second one is what they call a vignette. Now, In this case, less is going to be more. You don't want this obvious dark circle around the outside of your image or the outside of your subject, and then your subject being super bright because it's going to detract from the image. So, what do I mean? Let's go here to my second image here. So, this is how I did a subtle vignette for this image. Now, this was all done in camera, but if you don't have the option to do this in camera, you can do it in post production, and I'll talk about that in just a second. So, the second being subtle vignettes to draw attention to your subject. Now, here the subject is the Crystal Palace. So, the subtle vignette comes in where this area here, we have the bushes, then we have the foreground, and then we have this side here are slightly darker than my subject. With that subtle vignette, what happens is that the viewer's eye is drawn directly into the subject. Now, the reason being is, for the most part, our eyes will directly go to the lightest part of an image. And the reason being is some kind of psychology, and unfortunately, I am no expert in that, but that is what happens. And if you look and go into just viewing other people's images or doing research, look at when you're reviewing those images, look at where your eyes go to directly, and 9 times out of 10 it's going to be to the lightest part of your image or the image. Now, a third tip or technique that helps draw your attention into your subject is color differences. In this image here, the part of my subject here has warm colors in the lighting. Now, let's take the example of we're in winter Alaska. Everything outside is very cold, very blue. That's a place we don't want to be. Then we see a cabin in the middle of nowhere as we're walking, has these warm lights that is inviting to us. That's where we want to go to. And that's kind of the same concept here. With the warmer lights, our attention is drawn into it. That's where we want to go. Lastly, we'll talk about how to create depth in your images. So, going back to our beach scene here, what we have, the way I set this up is I have a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. Now, what that does is it creates an illusion that this is three-dimensional. Now, we all know in practicality, because it's a screen and or photographic paper, a canvas, metal print, whatever the case may be, it's two-dimensional, flat out. However, by using this technique where you have a foreground, middle ground, background, you create the illusion of three-dimensionality, and it helps give the image that wow factor. So here in the beach scene, as you can see, these bushes here and this grass is a foreground. The water on the left side is a foreground. The sand is a foreground. And then in the middle ground, we have these trees, these palm trees, and these bushes here, or these plants. Those are all middle ground. And then lastly, the sky itself is the background. So by doing that, setting up the frame this way, we have that illusion that this image is three-dimensional. Okay, so let's cancel out of this, go to the next one. So back to the Crystal Palace. Now, this is the same thing, with the Crystal Palace here. So we have a foreground, middle ground, and then background. So the foreground, we have the grass and these bushes are all foreground. So that is the closest. Then we have these trees here. We have this pond, this other tree here. All this is going to be your middle ground. And then lastly, we have the Crystal Palace itself, these trees back here, and then the sky. That's all background. Now, by doing it or setting up the framing this way, again, you create that illusion that your image is three-dimensional. And by doing that, you bring more wow factor into your images. So I hope this helps. And we're going to go back to past me to finish up the video. We'll see you. To recap, rule of thirds, more of a guideline. It'll split up your image or your view into three separate sections, both horizontally and vertically. Secondly, subject. Know your subject. Subject matter. Okay? Have a focal point for someone to look at. Then emphasize that subject. All right. Thirdly, when you're setting up to photograph, right, and you're getting ready to snap that picture, watch those edges. Okay? If we can't help it, Photoshop it out. But if we can help it on location, try to move around just a little bit so you don't have stuff creeping into your image that you don't want and will detract from your subject. Okay. All right. Then moving on to the bonus tips, leading lines. If you can put leading lines into your image, into the composition to help draw your viewer's eye into your subject, let's do that. Subtle vignettes. If you can't do the subtle vignettes on location, when you get back post-production, either Adobe Lightroom, Photoshop, or whatever your preference of post-production software, you can add it in afterwards. Strong advice, less is more. You don't want it to be very obvious that you have a vignette on there, because that will take away from your image. So in this case, less is more. What I like to do is I'll go into where it's very noticeable, and then I'll back it off until it kind of disappears and it's not really noticed anymore. All right. And then lastly, make our images three-dimensional. Remember, foreground, middle ground, background. If we stack it that way every single time, your images will improve and you'll have more wow factor because you're adding three-dimensionality to your image. All right. So guys, I want to thank you for hanging out. And again, I apologize for this video taking forever to get out to you guys, but I really, really appreciate your patience. And I know this video, I wanted to add my walkthrough and process out on the field. However, I wanted to make sure that this part is conveyed as best as possible and that it's understood, and take our time. And then I will do a separate video actually out in the field doing my process. Okay. But if at any point, anything in this video you did not understand, or you have questions because I didn't explain something better than I should have, please put it in the comments below and I will get back to you guys as soon as I possibly can. That way, when we get out to location and do my process, it's better understood. Okay. So guys, thank you so much, and we'll see you in the next one.